Well, with me here on set now is Nicholas Dungan, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and director of research at IRIS, the French Institute for the International and Strategic Affairs. Thanks very much for being with us on the programme. First of all, I mean, Macron's certainly picking his own way of doing things today, but he's been accused, hasn't he, of being arrogant in the past, and perhaps this new way of doing it at the Palace of Versailles not helping in that accusation.
Well, actually, the reason it's a new way of doing it has to do with the Constitution more than Macron. And as usual, history has the explanation. In the 1870s, France was divided between those who wanted to restore the monarchy and those who wanted to continue the republic. So it was decided in the Constitution that the president would not have the right to address Parliament, but would send a message that would be read by the head of the Senate or the president of the National Assembly. This was changed in the Constitution in 2008. And since then, both Sarkozy and François Hollande have used the opportunity once each to address the Congress, in other words, the Senate and the National Assembly sitting together at Versailles. So the reason it's new is not so much that Macron wants to do it, it's that that's the way it works now under the Constitution.
What's new is, though, that he's doing it right at the beginning, isn't it? Because the others
have
done it
that's
in
not new
times
either,
of,
actually,
of
because
difficulty.
that's not new either. De Gaulle, Pompidou and François Mitterrand sent messages to Parliament upon taking office, right at the beginning, as you say, explaining what their policy would be for their coming, in their cases, 7-year term, except that they had to do it by not giving a speech directly, but by having their message read. So actually, Macron is just abiding by the Constitution as it is today and following a tradition that already exists for presidents of the Fifth Republic.
Still annoyed some people, though, hasn't it?
It's annoyed them because they haven't actually looked at the distinction that Macron is providing. And one of the reasons I think people are annoyed is that certainly what we've seen with Macron is a new form of, or a renewed form of authority. And the President of the Republic and the Prime Minister have two different jobs. And the problem is that both Sarkozy and Hollande, the last two presidents, have acted more like a Prime Minister than like a president. So essentially, once again, Macron is restoring to the presidency a solemnity and a dignity. And some people in the media have said, well, he should have continued his July 14th interview, but you can't say the same thing in a conversation with reporters, which is by nature disjointed and on different topics, as you can in a well-thought-through policy statement. So his job is to set the goals for the next 5 years, and the Prime Minister's job tomorrow in his statement to the National Assembly is to figure out how we're going to get there. But the two are actually very compatible. There's also been an attempt to say, well, he's undercutting his prime minister. Not at all. He's actually making the distinction that exists between the job of President of the Republic and Prime Minister.
You talk about setting the goals. What goals do you think he's going to set?
I think domestically, reform of the labor code, reform of the tax code secondarily, and certainly a greater emphasis on education. These are the themes that came out in his presidential campaign, to the extent that he talks about foreign policy, in which case he would be doing that both to the Parliament in Congress assembled, as well as to the people. Obviously, the stress will be, first of all, on renewing Europe, a Europe which protects, and that's what states and governments are supposed to do. And if Europe does that, Europe will acquire a new respect. So I think it's very clever of him to emphasize that. And obviously, in terms of protection and security, the same reason that he was, to some extent, the same reason he was in Mali yesterday, the idea that we've got to defeat Daesh or ISIS and root it out, and so that the country is safe from terrorism.
And do you think he's going to be able to do those things? I mean, the first one you mentioned there, for example, the labour code reform, that's going to be highly controversial here in France. We're likely to see protests.
It's been highly controversial in the past, but I think, like so many reforms in France, this one's going to happen when everybody knows it actually should have happened quite a long time ago. The problem with the reform of the labor code is not actually the problem of companies or of individuals. It's the fact that the unions have interposed themselves, and the unions are only spokesmen for those people who already have work. And yet what the labor code needs to do is to make it easier for people who don't have work to find work. And if this country doesn't solve its 20% youth unemployment problem, it's going to have social issues that will go well beyond those associated with trying to reform the labor code. So I think the consultation process, which the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, and the Labor Minister, Muriel Pénicaud, have undertaken, is actually going to not short-circuit, but undermine any attempts to say that this needs to be a partisan political issue and not an issue of actual national importance.
And just finally, I mean, the opposition obviously severely weakened. Basically, there aren't that many of them, are there? But they're going to try and put up as many barricades as they can to what he wants to do.
I think it's very amusing to see that Mélenchon, for example, is boycotting the speech in Versailles. It's actually a very good sign because it shows how completely desperate he is and how little, as you say, of a genuine political opposition he'll be able to provide. So he's having to resort to symbols even more than what Macron is accused of doing.
OK, Nicholas Dungan, thank you very much for being with us on the programme today.